Welcome. This is an introduction to industrial hygiene for our industrial hygiene course. I am Dr. Chris Bradshaw, and we're going to go over some of the history, and I'm going to switch this to a slide presentation that you can watch as I go over it with you. And so we're going to kind of go back through some of the ancient times of different individuals that were involved in recognizing those things that affected people's health and how their recognition and some of the things that they did led into what today we call industrial hygiene, the occupational health of the workers. As you will see, we're going to start back pretty far back with Hippocrates, who lived back between 460 and 370 BC. He is called the father of medicine, and he is one that actually encouraged his students to study the environment of their patients and where they worked, what kind of things they came in contact with. He wrote several books about medicine, which included references to occupational settings. Now, what I want you to remember as we go through these, even though these individuals looked at the different diseases and where they came from, none of them really focused on prevention, which is what we do today. They looked on trying to figure out how to treat the illnesses that were developed from the exposures that these individuals had. So Hippocrates was probably one of the more important ones originally. In that time frame, which is quite a bit of ways ago. Then we come to Pliny the Elder, who was in the first century, 23 to 79. He recommended the respirators be made from animal bladders when workers were working around mercury. Now, one of the things you'll notice too about this in the history of hygiene is a lot of these individuals, the main occupation for a lot of the illnesses that they saw came out of mining. They mined for lead, for silver, for gold, for mercury, for a lot of different components. It was a big mining industry, and a lot of the workers were exposed to the dust and the different chemicals that were involved in those processes. And so Pliny kind of noticed that mercury dust and the vapor would cause some problems. And so he was really one of the first ones to recommend any kind of a respirator in prevention, which was kind of an abnormality at that time. Then we progress on to Claudius Galen. He was a Greek physician and surgeon and philosopher from 129 to 216 BC. And he traveled extensively looking at different occupations and different illnesses, and he really focused on some of the folklore, some of the ancient cures that were around in treating different things. But he was really involved in looking at mining, and he wrote about acid mist, which they used the acid in copper mines, and it etched their teeth and eroded them away. And he actually documented that. And his travels and trying to learn more about illnesses. So we progress on up to Gregorius Agricolae, which he was also really interested in minerals and rocks, and from a different perspective. He really enjoyed, looking at the different rock formations and stuff like that. So he's kind of considered the father of mineralogy by a lot in the industry, but he's also a physician. He described premature death among, the miners from silicosis, which we now know, and we've written standards for to control that fine dust that can be breathed in, that can cause, problems in the lung, the fibrosis that gets in the lung, and then that leads into the lung cancers. He lived in the Carpathian Mountains and wrote lots of books about mining. One of them is called the De Re Metallica. But again, they're looking at, the mining industry, and they're looking at the diseases, and they're trying to figure out the best way to treat those diseases. And then we come to a real interesting type person, Paracelsus, which his real name was Philippus Areolus Theophilus. I'm not even going to say it. I'll let you read that because it was a long name. But he was kind of a, I guess, in my perspective, maybe an arrogant type person. Traveled quite a bit. He was really interested in learning as much as he could about everything. He considered himself better than or more educated than a Roman doctor named Celsus. That's the reason he took the Paracelsus, meaning that he was better and more educated and a better physician than the Roman physician Celsius was. But Paracelsus was also credited with he's being the father of toxicology because he made the quote, "The dose is the poison," establishing this dose-response relationship that we'll talk about when we get to toxicology. But interesting enough, really he made the point that, hey, it doesn't make any difference what you eat or what you take in, it's how much you take in. So everything can be poisonous to us. We know water, if you drink too much water in a real short time frame, can cause electrolyte imbalance and can actually cause death. But we know that some things that are toxic to us can also be used therapeutically at the right dose in real small doses because it will maybe be beneficial to us in the small doses, but then it becomes toxic as the dose goes up. He also wrote about silicosis in minors. So, we're progressing. Now, you notice that Paracelsus didn't come along until 1493 to 1541. So there, we're still dealing with a lot of mining issues. We're still dealing with, the health of those people, and they're still looking at cures and how to treat them more than they are looking at prevention. Bernardo Ramazzini in 1633 to 1714 was another physician that came about. We call him the father of industrialized medicine. He wrote a very long, lengthy text on the De Morbis Artefactum Diatriba, which led into the different diseases that he were noticing, and describing the occupations that were associated with them. We actually know that he wrote and described diseases with 53 different occupations. And again, his treatment, he focused mostly on treatment rather than prevention. He emphasized the importance of asking about a patient's occupation. So he really tried to get his students and his other physicians to figure out what the disease was, look at what they were working in, what kind of environment. So they were making this association that there's certain occupations that the people are exposed to certain things that leads to certain diseases. Again, how do we treat that? We got to figure out what the disease is first. They didn't look at prevention so much. The Industrial Revolution, which came about in the 1700s, mainly firstly in Great Britain, where we had a lot of people that farmed, lived in the rural areas, and then as technology became alive and we started getting machines and steam engines and these different things to make, start manufacturing, we started seeing a big shift from the rural to the agricultural. From the agricultural to the manufacturing. This mainly started in Europe. So that change also brought about, exposure differences, a lot more things that people were going to be exposed to then. Other European nations began to go under the same process, and followed by others during the early 19th century, and then later on some of the other bigger countries, Russia and Japan, in the first half of the 20th century. So it's progressed, and we even have some third world countries today that are just now starting to go through maybe more of an industrial revolution. But that revolution dramatically changed the way people made their livings. And there's a lot more problems associated with some of those processes because of the machines, the dust, the gases, the exhaust, the noise exposures that they produce. And at that initial time, there was very few guidelines put in for preventing accidents or provided for workers, protection provided for workers. And the disease epidemic kind of started, with some of these industries. We started seeing a lot more health diseases associated with the exposures. So it was really a dramatic time. During that time, several people kind of stepped up and took notice of some of the problems that we were starting to see in industries. The first one that we'll talk about is purposeful pot from 1715 to 1788. Said he was the first to note an association between coal tar exposure and cancer, mainly in the chimney sweeps. Now, Europe used to use a lot of chimney sweeps to clean the chimneys to get the soot out, and they were young boys, mostly because they were smaller. They could get in those places and clean them, and they had a high incident of scrotal cancer, and purposeful pot made that association. So his report and his investigation led to the first act called the Chimney Sweeps Act of 1840 to kind of control the exposure for those individuals. So we're in the 1800s, and we're just now starting to see more emphasis, or the beginning emphasis of prevention really start to come into effect. Charles Thackeray, he wrote on the effects of arts, trades, and professions and all civic states and habits of living life and longevity, with suggestions for the removal of many agents which produce disease and shorten the duration of life. So kind of a really paradigm shift we're getting into here, where people were not looking so much at how do we treat a disease. Now we're starting to look at how do we prevent the disease. And we're shifting away from mining now into manufacturing, although mining was the biggest investigative area with a lot of diseases originally. Again, Charles noted that silicosis was seen among grinders, lead poisoning among pottery glazers, and a need for respiratory protection in these industries that created this fine dust. So he helped create the first Factory Act of 1833 and 1842. Benjamin McCready in the U.S., he wrote a book on occupational medicine, and his title was On the Influence of Trades, Professions, and Occupations in the United States in the Production of Disease. So he was the very first one in the United States to call attention to the growing number of industrial accidents and injuries in the 19th century in the United States, which led to Alice Hamilton. Now, we call her the father of industrial hygiene. Let me put it that way. Because she really investigated a lot of things, wrote a lot of papers, and wrote some books on occupational medicine, and it brought attention to a lot of the safety problems in a lot of the industries in the United States. So she was instrumental in helping to eliminate the use of white and yellow phosphorus in the manufacturing of matches, which caused a disease called flossy jaw. I'll show you a picture of that in here in a second. But she considered the founder of industrial hygiene in America. In 1911, she published a study of the white lead industry that became the first in a series of Bureau of Labor reports known as the Federal Survey. Her work, her investigative work, led to the establishment of a lot of laws that required job-related safety measures be incorporated in jobs. And I want you to notice here the Bureau of Labor. That's the first United States agency. That's going to progress and change over the years. We'll show you how that does that here in a second. But Alice Hamilton was very key in establishing some of the initial safety regulations, safety guidelines that were being put in factories. This is a picture of a phossy jaw. The phosphorus somehow would create this fistula that would pus out, and then eventually it would bust and drain, and it would stink. And so she's the one that made that association that the phosphorus was causing this. Just kind of a quick look at some of the laws and how it progressed. In Britain, we had the Factory Act of 1802, which didn't allow for inspections. Then we had, 31 years later, we had the Factory Act of 1833 with limited hours of work for children. Now, today, if you look at third world countries, they still use children in a lot of industries, and they're exposed to a lot of dangerous chemicals and dust. and particulates and stuff. And the problem with kids is that they're growing. They're incorporating the stuff that they're exposed to that soaks through their skin, that they breathe in, and some of that is incorporated into their structure, and it causes health effects at a very young age. Well, the industrialized nations noticed this a long time ago, and they even started limiting children. And the 1833 Act actually allowed for some inspections. The Factory Act of 1864, and then again in 1878, started requiring the use of ventilation to reduce that concentration of those chemicals or those dust down to levels that were more acceptable. Then the Factory Act of 1901 created regulations and ability to enforce control measures. So we see a lot of changes from the 19th century to the 20th. It's a very slow progression, but by the 20th century, we're starting to see some better regulations and actions to enforce controls. In the United States, we started out in Massachusetts. They passed the first safety and health regulation or legislation in 1877. And then in 1890, 9 states in the United States provided factory inspectors. 13 states required machine guarding, because of pinch points, people getting caught, mutilated, amputations. We see that with a lot of equipment. Well, 13 states required that the machines had to be guarded. 21 states made limited provision for health hazards. So we're slowly starting to see a change, a paradigm shift in the way we think about the worker and his environment. In 1903, the U.S. Bureau of Labor, this is where Allison Hamilton worked for, and she helped produce a lot of these papers, publishes a graphically detailed study of occupational fatalities and illnesses in the United States. So 1903, that was the first time statistics was really used to publish a broad look at the fatalities and injuries and illnesses that were happening in the United States in manufacturing. 1905, Massachusetts, again, they're the ones that first passed any legislation. They appointed the health inspectors to evaluate different occupations. And then in 1911, Wisconsin was the first state to adopt workers' compensation laws. A lot of us today may think that we've always had workers' compensation laws. No, it's not the case. So they really kind of migrated in the last 100 years and have, now we have them throughout the United States. In varying degrees, they still change from state to state or with their variations, but still, before 1911, if you got hurt, you knew you were taking the risk on your own. It was your responsibility to protect yourself, and the company had nothing to do with providing you with that protection. So you were supposed to be knowledgeable enough to know what to do, and unfortunately, a lot of people weren't. 1913, the Department of Labor is established by President Taft. So the Bureau of Labor is converted over now to the Department of Labor. In 1933, Frances Perkins, the first woman to be the new Secretary of Labor, is appointed. Then in 1934, Perkins creates the Bureau of Labor Standards. This is the first permanent federal agency established to promote safety and health for workers. Then the Social Security Act went in 1935, and it did provide some funds for industrial high programs at the state level. So, we didn't even have the term industrial hygiene until, the late 1800s, early 1900s. And Alice Hamilton, again, is that what we would call the father of that industry of promoting, industrial hygiene. And again, the definition of hygiene that you need to learn is the science and art devoted to the anticipation, recognition, evaluation, and control of those stressors in the workplace. Stressors is the chemical, the biological, the ergonomic, and the physical things that are put on the body that can cause injury or illness. And so the Social Security Act of 1935 actually provided some funds for establishing those programs. Then we see the Wash-Healy Act, Public Contracts Act in 1936. This act required federal contractors to to follow or comply with safety and health standards that they had written at that time. That all leads us to 1970. This is a big moment in the workers' rights to protection, when President Richard Nixon signed into law the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And on December 29th, 1970, it became effective April the 28th, 1971. And it created the OSHA administration, it created the Review Commission, and it created our research into occupational exposures, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. OSHA is housed with the Department of Labor, but NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, is housed with the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. But they're all, both of the administration and the research part were created out of the Act of 1971. Well, I hate to regress and go back to looking at tragedies, but tragedies makes change in our laws and the way we perceive stuff. And if we look back to 1911, before some of the health and safety standards were well established in the United States, we had a major disaster that brought major attention, in the United States to our working conditions. And that first one was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City on March 25th, 1911. In 15 minutes, a fire broke out, and in 15 minutes, 146 women died because of the conditions: overcrowding, very limited housekeeping, locked doors, no exits. This really outraged a lot of people. If you'll go back, we have a film that you'll watch later this semester on that fire. But when you look at the documentaries and everything, there was some things that led up to this outrage. There was a strike because the working conditions were pitiful. These women were working 12, 15, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, in unhealthy conditions, and they were trying to get it changed, but it was kind of dragging its feet. But this incident here at the Triangle Shirtwaist building, when that many people died, that many women, and most of them young, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old. A lot of them were under 20 years old. When that happened, then the city and the public, kind of threw an outrage, and the city established the Bureau of Fire Investigation later that same year with the powers to improve the factory safety issues. This also increased support for the garment workers to organize into unions, which that's what they were trying to do to get better working conditions. This is a couple of pictures from the fire. A lot of women had to jump out of the windows. They couldn't get out, so they were jumping to their death instead of burning. Very tragic scene overall. This is one of the workrooms that caught on fire. They were sewing, so the material is very flammable. Lots of flammable, particulate laying around on the floor. And when however it started with a match, a cigarette, or whatever, it just caught and it went like crazy, and the women couldn't go nowhere fast enough. Another major incident was the Hot Mess Tunnel in West Virginia. This one is in 1930 near Golly Bridge, West Virginia. Union Carbide dug a tunnel through a mountain that contained a high concentration of quartz, which was silica, and they were doing a dry drilling because that way the bits wouldn't run out as bad or as fast. And so that dry drilling creates a lot of dust. As many as 2,000 miners, mostly African American, contracted silicosis and died. 169 workers were buried in unmarked trenches 40 miles from the site, where relatives were never notified. This is 1930. What happened in 1929, 1930? We were in the Depression. So people were looking for work anywhere. They were traveling. They had not good communication back then. So some of these workers, nobody knew where they were from or who the relatives were or how to contact them. But then again, some of them, they just didn't want anybody to know what was going on. I think that was a kind of a Union Carbide policy, which they were never, they were investigated, but no action was ever taken against them. The tunnel was completed in 1935, and it's still operating as a hydropower electric facility. But it took this and other diseases along the way to eventually recognize silicosis as a compensable disease for workers' comp. But a lot of people suffered and died before that ever became effective. Radium dial painters. We used a lot of people during World War I and World War II to paint the gauges and things that were used in planes and military equipment and just on and on. But after World War I, where they used so much of this, a lot of the women had cancers of the neck and the head, and they got someone went into leukemia, someone got anemia severe, and eventually these cancers became recognized as compensable disease. And it actually set up a time period that workers could discover compensable diseases. And so today, if you're exposed to chemicals, you're supposed to keep those records of those individuals for a lifetime, because they might come back in 20 years and it may be attributed to that. So we have to keep those records. Here's kind of a deal. You see how they're in there just one beside the other. And one of the things they would require them to do is to stiffen up or to make the brush. They would roll the tip of the brush with their hands, but they would lick it first and then roll the tip to get it real sharp, because they're painting little tiny, hands on a clock or a dial or a gauge or something. And so it's very intense, work, but to get it real sharp, they'd stick it in their mouth, or they'd lick their fingers. And so they were ingesting this radioactive material. Mining disasters, we've had a lot of those over the years. It's really changed the mining industry and the safety regulations. The Farmington mine disaster in 1968 killed 78 men. The exact cause of the explosion was not known at that time. It was believed to be methane gas and possibly the coal dust that he exploded. But out of that mining incident, we got the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969, which led into eventually MSHA. The Act strengthened enforcement powers of mine inspectors, which now requires 4 annual inspections for underground coal and 2 for surface mines. Inspectors could then, with this act, shut down mines for imminent hazards, and workers could request inspections. So another mining disaster, the Cherry Coal Mine in 1910 killed 259 men. It led to stronger fire and safety regulations and workers' compensation. The Sunshine Silver Mine fire in Idaho in 1972 killed 91 miners, led to stronger regulations for metal and non-metal mines. And then we get into some construction disasters. The worst construction accident in U.S. history was at Willow Island, West Virginia, when a cooling tower for a coal-fired power plant partially collapsed, killing 51 workers. It says the cause of the accident was imposition of heavy loads before the concrete had gained adequate strength. And I had read a documentary on this. You can see on the on the right-hand screen, that was the scaffolding that collapsed. The engineer that designed the scaffolding never had it tested and approved. It was a unique scaffolding system and it worked very well, but apparently they had undone some of the bolts a little bit before the concrete totally cured. So they didn't have it fully attached, and they raised it up to the next level before the concrete had cured, or was in the process of doing that, and that's what apparently caused the collapse. But again, it killed 51 men, 1978, April the 27th. And of course, a terrorist attack that killed many, and many have suffered since then, was the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. And it says that 21% of rescue workers have developed asthma as a real result of the exposure to the dust that was generated from those collapses. It's estimated that 25,500 people may have developed new asthma from being in the towers. and in that vicinity because of all that concrete dust that was in the air that they were breathing during the rescue efforts. Um, so, we've had all these different accidents. We try to understand, the impact of them, but we try to make changes to our laws to protect people. So the question comes back, hygiene is, we've seen it all the way from Hippocrates, that individuals have been interested in what causes human health. And today we look at how do we prevent those incidents. And that's kind of what a hygienist does. So an industrial hygienist, more of a scientist or an engineer committed to practicing health and safety of people in the workplace and the community, says it's considered a science, but it's also an art because it involves judgment. You have to think. You have to use that higher cognitive reasoning to investigate, to ask the right questions, to make the right judgment. You got to be creative on how we're going to control it. And there's human interaction, but that all allows us to anticipate the problems that may arise from a process, to recognize as soon as we see it that there's something might be out of that process that could cause a health, but how to evaluate, how to measure. Hygiene uses a lot more technology, a lot of math to measure concentrations in the air, dust in the air, the noise level, the radiation level. We have to evaluate and measure what's there so we'll know what's going to impact people. But then we have to be able to control it, recommend a control, a method of preventing it from getting to people. So we say that judgment, that creativity, that interaction with people allows us to anticipate, recognize, evaluate, and control those stressors, the chemical, the biological, the physical, the ergonomic, that are found in the workplace, so we can prevent injury, illness, or impairment to workers and the community. So many of you might go on to become an industrial hygienist, and I encourage you. That's a great field in its own with lots of opportunities. The safety professional, they're the ones that are engaged in the prevention of accidents and incidents and events that can harm people or the property or the environment. They use qualitative and quantitative analysis of simple and complex products, systems, operations, and activities to identify hazards. In my mind, the safety professional is more the visual. They're looking at those things that could potentially harm, could be a hazard. The industrial hygienist is the one that's trying to establish the unseen, the controls for the unseen. That chemical exposure. You can't always smell or taste a chemical in the air, but you're breathing it. So there's a little bit of difference between the two, but they're both important, uniting together to protect the workers. And so that's the end of that. And let me go back here. So I hope a lot of this information is not in your textbook. It's pulled from other resources. There's a little bit in chapter 1 that relates back to the definition of hygiene and what it is. So please take the time to go through the PowerPoint again, look at some of these dates. You'll see them again on some of the exams. But read chapter 1 and start understanding what hygiene is and how important it is. It is a great field. It's an interesting field. It's a field that you have to use your biology, chemistry, math, physics to really determine sometimes how to measure and how to control those things that we hopefully, as we go through the course, that you're going to be better at recognizing, anticipating that those things that can cause worker health. And that's what it's all about. We want to protect people every day so that they can go home and have all 10 fingers, all 10 toes, both eyes, both ears, nose, lungs to breathe with, so that they can go do the other things they enjoy doing outside of work. They have to work to provide for your family, to get the things you need to sustain yourself. But there's also things that are relaxing and enjoying and hobbies that you like to do. We'll do it with everything working. That's important. And don't forget that, and don't take light of it, because safety is important for everybody. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.